Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is Into the Infinite. I'm Charlie, and I'm so glad that you're here. So, today we're talking about boundaries. What? This is the Alchemical Book Club, where we look at different books and tools to help you in your highest healing and on the spiritual path and journey. So, they help you also to integrate and alchemize emotions in service to your creativity, in service to what you want to put into the world. So, we're going to dive in. This book is fantastic. It's about boundaries, and it has a bit of a spin on boundaries that I think is really important. So let's get into it. So this book is called Empowered Boundaries. Woo. Speaking Truth, Setting Boundaries, and Inspiring Social Change by Christien Storm. The link is in the description below if this appeals to you and you would like to get yourself a copy. I highly recommend it. It's so good. So this book looks at boundaries and how we set them, but the spin on it that is really cool is that it takes a systems view. What the heck does that mean? The systems view looks at the context within which we set boundaries. So, we look at boundary setting and say, well, this is a boundary and this is what I need. For folks who are equity seeking, who are part of equity seeking groups or who are marginalized, boundary setting is not so simple a process at times, right? We forget that in a lot of like self-help culture and that I guess self-improvement world tends to individualize a lot of things, which is amazing for taking responsibility because we still do have to do that in the world, no doubt, no question. So I have a little cowlick here, but we have to understand that those boundaries are existing within a specific context, right? So if you are racialized, if you are a woman, if you have intersections at multiples of these, okay? Multiples. So if you're racialized, if you are a woman, if you are a person with disabilities, if you're autistic, if you're neurodivergent in any capacity, if you are someone who lives with PTSD, if you have mental health challenges, if you come from a socioeconomic background that is not, middle or upper middle class, these boundaries can be harder to articulate, right? Because there's a context within which we're existing. So what I love about this book is it is, towards the end of the book, it calls it compassionate curiosity. And I love that term because it really takes a good look at how we need to look at ourselves and the needs that we have when we articulate them in the world. But what I love about this book too is that it doesn't ignore the systems view. It integrates it and it brings us to a place of wholeness. It welcomes that wholeness because we can't forget that we exist in a system, right? As a trans person, I cannot, anytime I leave my house, I am acutely aware of who I am, so you can't forget that. And that, like, most people would be like, well, of course you should recognize that. Yeah. But then I think about it too, if I put this, the experiences I've had lately on this, where, as my voice gets deeper and as my face shape changes, all of that stuff, it is harder for people to read me as a woman or feminine, right? Which is amazing. I'm so excited for that. Like, please, more of this, please. More. Gender euphoria to the nth degree. Love it. But the thing that I'm starting to notice, and that's just, it pisses me off so much, is that there is a marked difference in the way that people respect my boundaries out in public when they view me as this, in this way, as man or masculine, whatever the hell that means, than woman. And it it makes my head want to explode, honestly. There are a lot of challenges that I face as a trans person, so I'm not pushing those away. So for folks who come here who are trans, you're welcome. This isn't a conversation where I'm pushing that truth away. I'm saying this in the context of, if I'm out and I say no thank you to something, that is respected immediately when people read me in one specific way. And then I'll be out with friends and things will happen where the women in the group are their boundaries are pushed further, even if it's just ordering things at restaurants or, if we're hanging out and we go into a store and one of my friends I'll say, no, thank you. And they'll push and be like, oh, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And it's like, no, thank you is enough. That no is a complete sentence, right? So it's a very interesting process to see, and to individualize this can really make us, it can make us judge ourselves really harshly. And I think it's sort of like, women who say no are often deemed as like cold-hearted and, all of these things, these assumptions that we make. Whereas men that do it are strong and they know themselves and they're assertive, right? So it's also these implications. And I share that right there to say that we do indeed exist in systems. As much as people might say, well, it's up to you to change it. It is up to you to take responsibility for and change what you can. But it's even more important for you to have compassion for the fact that the world outside may not respect your boundaries in the way that you want. So how can we articulate them and create a life for ourselves using this knowledge that allows us to change other systems, right? And to move within systems that we exist in a way that brings us hope and that allows for even more change, for the system to change altogether. Just as a side note, it's why I'm so damn excited for the Pluto in Aquarius generation, right? I'm a Pluto in Scorpio generation, so there's a lot happening there. But the Pluto in Capricorn generation is we're seeing a lot of those things in what we value in systems change. And I think I'm pumped to see what's going to come. So just as a side note for my astrology geeks that, my astrology geeks, who are similarly interested, I'm excited for that. And I hope you are too, because that's, we're getting to these places of change. And this book is an excellent catalyst for your change. So let's talk about it as I squeak. Oh my God. Boundaries can be really difficult to hold, right? This book talks about, it's a primer on how we can hold boundaries and set them in a way that honors us and that doesn't allow people to run roughshod over them and to say no to them as easily. And this is more related to interpersonal relationships, some with strangers. But one of the things that I love that it does is it breaks down, the specifics of it. And it's easy to say the semantics of breaking down a boundary, but it's really just the specifics of how we set them in a way that honors us and makes it really difficult for even within systems to hold boundaries that mean something to us, that allow us to thrive, right? So the system's take on boundaries is really just that we are, so I wrote here that it honors where we are internally, but also has an eye towards the realities of the systems that we live in that inform our boundaries. Because that can be a thing too, right? It informs our boundaries. Absolutely. So boundaries really are just a way for us to communicate what we want and need. We also need to be very clear about them. And this book gives you a framework for setting goals around it and understanding what's important about the boundary to you. Why do you want to set it, right? It talks about the intentionality behind setting these boundaries. And, it looks at the things that can be a little bit of a struggle for us when we set boundaries, things like vulnerability, trauma responses, which are legitimate. If we have come from, I want to say harder backgrounds, that's an overgeneralization and an oversimplification. So just bear with me. But if we come from more difficult or challenging backgrounds, we can have inherited trauma from childhood that we carry with us. And it's like the brain starts to store a trauma response about boundaries and how well they will be respected and whether we're even deserving of setting them in the first place, right? And this can also happen when we get into relationships that are particularly harmful. And, abusive relationships don't have to mean that people, it's not always physical abuse. It can be psychological and emotional and verbal. And those three together can really make us question our boundaries and whether we have a right to set them. So these kind of trauma responses that we can inherit make us question not just the validity of our boundaries, but also the what will happen after we set them that can really make it difficult. And that's what I love about this book is it meets you where you are, right? It meets you where you are. It doesn't say, well, that was a bad experience that happened once. No, it sits and it gives you questions to tangibly work through those responses and what may not have worked for you before and meets you in that space, in that liminal space and holds space for you on its pages. It is phenomenal in that way. So there's also unequal power dynamics too. So for example, as a trans person, if I am, if I set a boundary with someone who is cisgender and who has more power than I do, and power can mean so many different things, right? I'm not talking about empowered versus disempowered. I'm talking about like a politician. I'm talking about, someone who has that tangible power above you. I think of hierarchies as funny because they're all linear, but we just believe them to be hierarchized based on access to things like whose voice is valued more, right? That's how power dynamics can come into play. But we need to consider these power dynamics when we're setting boundaries. Without that system's view, though, it neglects this a lot of the time. It neglects it a lot of the time. As someone who is neurodivergent, power dynamics play a huge role, because sometimes I communicate things and it doesn't always land the way that it's meant to. And then I spend so much time going back and be like, no, this is what I actually meant. When it's like, it's okay to just let it go and let it be. People are going to love you and hate you, and it has nothing to do with you. Abraham Hicks quote, right? So it's really about setting boundaries that are clearly communicated, but that also respect where you are without you needing to jump through hoops to explain it or justify. Which brings me to another point that the book makes, and I'm going to quote this because this is said so beautifully. So we shouldn't have to win the right to our boundaries, nor should we have to verify the necessity or authenticity of our boundaries with a more logical argument, right? We can get into these places where people debate us about, well, is that really that important? And like they start to do these they create these hoops that we have to jump through, logistically speaking, just to get our needs met. That's a toxic relationship. That's a really good sign. That's a good sign of a toxic relationship. So if you're in one of those situations, understand where you are first and then work your way out of that, right? There are ways to move away from that and out of that. And I highly recommend it, because that is a significant sign of toxicity that you do not deserve, in the very least, my darlings, at all. So that quote continues onto the next page, page 18. When boundary setting is approached like a debate, it suggests that one's right to boundaries has to be proven. This also suggests that without proof, there should be no boundary. This strategy embodies the myth that by hearing both sides, so the one that says that this is both sides, the side that says that you should have the boundary, you, and then the side that disagrees with your boundary, that's not a debate, right? This strategy embodies the myth that by hearing both sides, we arrive at an objective truth. Boundaries are not objective, they are subjective, and rightly so. And I think that that's huge right now, huge. I mean, I try to stay as far away from comment sections aside from this channel. I mean, I sprinkle that like good stuff wherever I can. But in specific places, I do try to stay away from them, because they are so filled with vitriol and hatred. And folks who would have you believe that your boundaries are worthy of debate, and that, this act of debating your boundaries is really, it does so much harm to you. And I wish you freedom from that if you're in that situation. But if you needed to hear it, your boundaries aren't debatable. What you need is not up for debate. It's not something that is, there's compromises that you can make in relationships, in your connections, in your friendships with your family. But there's a fundamental boundary that we all have. There are fundamental boundaries that they are not up for debate, nor should they be. So, it takes a look at how we set boundaries, right? So naming what we want. Well, first and foremost, setting very clear goals, naming the boundary, holding the boundary, and facing the challenges that we sometimes face, right? In terms of folks who would try to victim blame you, and by victim blaming, it means, getting upset with you for holding the boundary. We get into things that, where we have to do things like a broken record is the term that was used in the book, where you just have to repeat the boundary. No, thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you. And it can get frustrating, but then eventually you may have to end, contact or cut it off for a time until someone understands that you're serious about it, right? So there's these hooks that folks can get us into as well, and the book outlines this beautifully. So if you have not, if that's not in your cart yet, I hope that you do pick it up. Not because I don't get much kickback for you purchasing it. It's really just because I want everybody to have this awareness of boundaries. Because the boundaries that we hold in our lives don't just support us getting somewhere in it. It helps us to create a life of peace, free of chaos. And that is the seed where every single possible, strong root of your heart space in this world, that's how it takes root. So it takes root in the absence of that kind of chaos. And, chaos is could be just called drama, but drama, I think, tends to go different places for folks mentally, but chaos is very evocative for many. So I use that terminology instead. So when folks try to push our boundaries, it's really important to go to that broken record place and to just stick to the descriptions of facts, right? You do not need to explain your boundary. You don't need to justify it. And if you stick to the facts of what's happening, what is actually happening, describe that, not the boundary itself. And that's where we can get kind of roped into these conversations with folks that don't need to happen, because what the conversation is not about curiosity about the boundary. It's trying to convince you not to have one. So that's really important too. And then the book talks about embodiment and how embodiment is a really important way for us to understand doubt and worry and intuition. And this part is the bread and butter of this book. Oh my goodness. It talks about intuition and how a lot of our intuition is information that we make meaning of. So sensory information that we make meaning of. That informs our view of the world, and it's a social conditioning. So that's how our intuition, which is innate, like intuition is in here, everyone has it, but there are ways that it can be socially conditioned over time. So that's where, similar to the Rumi quote that talks about removing all of the blocks to love, what we end up getting into is this place where we have to remove the blocks to our intuition that we've learned, right? And intuition in systems, with a systems take of intuition, whoa, let me just punch the camera in the microphone. Ooh, sorry about that. But we get into this place where we feel like the things that we perceive, if we have not had safe environments growing up, our intuition will perceive threat in many places where it may not exist. And I'm not maligning that process, right? I have been diagnosed with PTSD and have had to work through that sort of hypersensitivity and hyper awareness and vigilance to everything, right? That this was several years ago. And it was, I guess 2 or 3 years ago now, a bit of a flare of it when I was under a lot of duress, and I got much help for it. But I can say with experience, flashbacks do happen, right? Vigilance is part of this. So this is where this particular book really helps you to have, it helps you to have more compassion for yourself, which you really deserve. You deserve to know that you're not alone for thinking like, why is it that boundaries feel so damn hard sometimes? It's because we live in a system that may not be designed or, constructed in a way that is meant to support your boundary holding. And when you get that, when you sit in that place and you're like, oh, that's why it's been so hard, you depersonalize the difficulty because it becomes less about you and your efforts. And it's more, the responsibility is placed equally both upon what you can change and handle and the system that is upholding this difficulty and this insistence that you shouldn't have boundary, or you have to explain them, or you owe people explanations, or, somehow your voice matters less, which is just drives me up the wall. But we are, and I think too that this idea of intuition, so the quote is on page 55, and it says, people are taught how to interpret sensations through social learning. And this social learning is that social conditioning. So sometimes we're taught to discount how we feel, and that innate, that intuition, that little ping that happens where we're like, oh, gut check, that's a bad feeling. Like you recognize it. Not sure why I said it like a sheep, but there you have it. But it's just, there's something that's off. But we're taught sometimes to ignore it, to be, the one that gives more, because we're so giving, because we're the caretakers, we're the nurturers, right? Because we want people to like us, because we have to win hearts and minds, because we know that if we get upset, stereotypes will be put upon us, like angry black woman, or the unlikable gay who's supposed to be everyone's BFF, right? That kind of idea. These things will be pushed upon us. And that's where we can really discount our intuition. We can turn it off and say it doesn't matter when it in fact does. So this process of understanding that some boundaries are impacted by intuition heavily, like boundaries can be, neglected, and intuition can be twisted around a bit because we're taught to ignore our own and to take on a system to apply the template of a system into our heart that tells us what's actually up when our boundaries are always giving us this information anyway, right? So that's something that's really important. And they call it the reflective loop in that chapter, which is, I visualize it as an infinity loop, where there are different checkpoints on that loop that allow you to understand where the boundary is coming from, why you're setting it, the context within which you're setting it, and also the barriers to setting it, as well as why you want the boundary there in the first place, and the dynamics of upholding it in the long run. So that is an incredible chapter that is profound, my friends. It talks about how intuition is also not the key to prevention, which is a really important thing to note too. Compassionate curiosity, right? Intuition when we think about intuition as preventative, there are still things that people are going to do that are going to hurt us. There are still things that people are going to do that suck the life out of us. Does it have to last forever? No, it can last for a lot less time. But by assuming that if we intuit situations correctly, we will not be misperceived, we will not be misheard, people will not think poorly of us. Or if we think, it's this misapplication of intuition as prevention or, curative, when we're interacting with people who are on their own paths and we are also in a process of learning. And, that's what life is an unfolding, right? It's an unfolding that doesn't stop. Not until you leave this planet, at least, and not because you're going to space. So, this idea of we need to sort of divest from this idea that intuition is preventative or curative, because it stops this really relentless blame cycle, and this it keeps us held. It suspends us in this this place of victimhood when we deserve so much more. Right? There's a difference between victimhood and victimizing yourself, right? After the situation has happened. And that can get there, but I think victimhood is something that we don't have to carry. Like, we no longer have to carry that backpack full of all of those stories of what that means. And a big part of this, I find, for empath communities, for empaths in general, a huge part of this is understanding that intuition could not have stopped something from happening in the past. Intuition could not have cured a way that you are, and how does that relate to boundaries? The book outlines this perfectly, and it talks about how intuition can be a way that we reflect on our boundaries and a way that we interpret the need for them, right? So if we have some kind of trauma bonding going on with folks, then we can welcome them back in over and over and over again. When our intuition is just like red light, like, this is not going to go well. And we welcome them in because there's that trauma aspect. And then we look back on it and say intuitively, shit, right? Like, we're like, oh, but this book gives you a lot of tools on how to deal with that. And it also looks at things from a non-judgmental framework, which is really important too. It emphasizes the importance of this when we're reflecting on our boundaries and really doing the work to make sure that they're intentional. So the non-judgmental piece kind of helps us to stay in a place of integrity with ourselves when we're setting the boundary, and also to stay in a place of integrity with others because we're able to be deeply honest with others about what we need. And that kind of frees us up, right? I've often said, and I've said in other videos too, that the best way to clear your energy is to tell the truth, tell your whole truth. Instant energy shift. It lifts your energy just to be completely honest. It is incredible, honestly. But that idea of non-judgmental is basically sticking to facts and descriptions rather than shorthand judgments. So shorthand judgments are easy and they're quick, and non-judgmental descriptions can take time. It's conscientious work, right? Once we say, oh, that's a good job, the longhand is you did X, Y, and Z thing. And the shorthand judgment is good job. But I find too that this non-judgmental framework, that's obviously, it's technically a judgment, but what I'm talking about is the way that we apply it in our boundaries and understanding ourselves, right? Good job. Here are the reasons why. That's how it's like flexing that muscle of description. And it's not throwing shorthand out the window altogether. The author talks about this. What we're actually doing is being more intentional about when we use shorthand and why, so that we're not just throwing someone or something or some aspect of ourselves when we do this to other people, right? Throw someone else under the bus, or just like push that in a specific direction, or, we judge them. We may also be judging ourselves. So this intentionality piece and compassionate curiosity helps us to understand where our projections may be really hurting us in the long run. So the book, there's one chapter in particular that talks about safety, and that's the other thing that they talk about. So it's like community care, building connections, building a support system for yourself, and this reactive mindset and safety, right? Safety means something completely different for a whole lot of people. It is a lot about whether or not we are understanding that we deserve safety, understanding that whether or not we deserve and are worthy of a world that is safe. We have to start there first, right? That's the kind of, we go through this checklist mentally. Do we deserve it? And what we can get into is places where we talk ourselves out of our boundaries because it's not safe. And respect the safety piece, definitely respect the safety piece. one of the things that I like about this book is that it doesn't really talk about, it doesn't neglect safety as a sort of system that we're operating within. It doesn't neglect that as something that we need to focus on, because we don't always, right? We sometimes push it away and say it's an individual thing and it's a self-improvement thing. But again, we also exist in a system, right? For me as a trans person, if I had said to that person outside the washroom in Walmart, I have told the story in other videos, but I left a washroom in Walmart and someone was waiting for me outside the bathroom to tell me that I was in the wrong one. If in that situation, if I had not, I guess, navigated boundaries and my safety well, I could have gotten into a real situation that would have harmed me physically. So it's super important for us to pull back and understand the safety take too when we articulate boundaries, and to forgive ourselves so that we can get into places that are safe where our boundaries can be upheld, right? So it's not about looking at situations being like, oh, why didn't I get to blah, blah, blah. No, it's not always that case. Sometimes we have to forgive ourselves for the way that we believe that it's an us thing. And sometimes we have to understand that and pull back. We do live in a system and a context. Our context is vitally important. It's vitally important. I'm not saying don't take personal responsibility, because we have to, even in those systems, even in places that, even in places where growth is harsh and difficult or challenging, and, it's hard. We still have to take that aspect of personal responsibility so that we can build something for ourselves that defies what the system tells us exists for us. So this book is so good. Have you read it yet? If not, I hope so. I hope you get to read it. Again, the link is in the description below. Do check it out. Empowered Boundaries. If you like this video and this book, feel free to like and subscribe. It helps me to grow the channel. And I'm so grateful to be able to do this and to share wisdom here. So thank you so much for your time and your eyes and your energy. Even on the tarot videos, it means the absolute freaking world to me. You cannot imagine. So love it. And I love responding to people's comments. So keep on leaving them. I'm happy to do so. I'm happy to reply to them. But if this is where we part though, my friends, I hope that you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or night, wherever this finds you on the time-space continuum. Take care and have a fantastic day.